Well, this is Brent Allen Winters, commonlawyer.com, www.commonlawyer.com, and this, friends, neighbors, and kin, is a Common Lawyer comments concerning our Constitution of the United States. A brief of common law government. Its words and phrases are couched in the language of our common law, drafted and ratified by men who lived, moved, and breathed the ambient atmosphere of our common law tradition. No place in the world at that time did people know more about our common law than here. Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, sometimes called the Commentaries on the Common Law, sold by far and away more volumes among the 2.5 million Americans that lived in the colonies at that time. Closer to 3 million. Somewhere between that. 2.5 and 3 million. Far and away more were sold here than were sold in England, of approximately 8 million souls at that time. And how do we know? Because we have the records of the printers in England that shipped the copies to America and who ordered them. And if you want to know more about that, and more specifically, you get the comparative law text, Excellence of the Common Law, comparing and contrasting our law of the land, our common law, with the law of the city, the civil law, the civil canon laws of Rome on every continent and every age. That's called comparative law. Those are the only two traditions of religion, law, and government available to mankind. Our law of the land, our common law, or the law of the city. The law of the city of religion, law, and government comes under 10,000 labels, all claiming to be different, but they aren't fundamentally. They're all the same. And that stands in contradistinction to the true government that God has ordained by the laws of nature, and the laws of nature is God. The laws of nature, that's a phrase Blackstone uses to describe our common law, and the laws of nature is God is a phrase Blackstone uses in his commentaries, those ones I was telling you about, that he uses to describe our Bible, the laws of nature is God. Well, that's the truth of the matter. It's just the fact of the matter. Let's keep going in this Catechism of our Constitution by Arthur Stansbury, meant to be used in the schools, published 1828. Is some government necessary for every country? Answer, certainly. Why? Because men are not angels. They're not. Oh, they have things that are good that pop up once in a while. I just read this morning Paul the Apostle complaining that the things he doesn't want to do, he does regularly. The sins he doesn't want to commit, he commits how often? Regularly. Oh, who will deliver me from this body of death? Sin dwells in your fleshly body. But what is born in you from above, says the book, the Bible. The laws of nature is God. What is born in you is clean and perfect and is growing. That's why you have the option as a Christian man or woman, having been born of the Spirit, you have the option to do something other people don't have an option to do. What is it? Right. God's will. I mean, even when somebody that's not born from above inadvertently does God's will, they do it for the wrong reason. They do the wrong thing to gain an advantage for the wrong reason, to do something that isn't right. And as our common law says, any wrong thing achieved by doing right things is still illegal. It's not lawful. It's wrong. Our law says you're not allowed to use lawful things you do to achieve an unlawful end. Isn't that what Paul the Apostle says in the Bible? He says the law of God, this will of God expressed here, that's what this book's all about, is his will, is good as long as a fellow uses it. How? Lawfully. Balaam did not use the law of God lawfully. He abused the law of God. He abused what is good to get an unlawful result. I got to write that down about Balaam. I want to make sure and put a note in the winterized version of the Bible. He didn't use it. He abused the law of God to achieve an unlawful end. Paul said the same thing, and he was referring to that, no doubt, when he said it's a principle throughout the Bible, and it's a principle of our common law. We recognize that in the relationships around us. Question number 7, cannot all the people of a country govern themselves? Answer, if every man was perfectly virtuous and knew what would be best for himself and others, they might. They might what? Oh, govern themselves. If a man was perfectly virtuous and knew what would be best for himself and others, they might. But this is far from being the case, he says, and therefore the people of every country are and must be governed. Let's put it this way. For the Christian man and woman, the law is made because we are lawless. It dwells in our flesh, not in our spirit. That's what the Bible says, but it's still here in our flesh. And we're trying to, God is working us so that our flesh obeys our spirit more and more. That's called, in Christianity, sanctification. You're getting better, not worse. If you're born from above, don't worry about it. God's a perfect Father. He'll whip you into shape. You'll get better. And he doesn't make any mistakes. But he does discipline his own. It can be rough, but it's for your good, as we used to say with our children, as my parents used to say to me, this is for your good. And then the pain would be applied. That's what God does. I like the way he says this. Again, let me read this. Cannot all people of a country govern themselves? You've heard the term self-government. Yes, Christian folk can do that. They can do it. Doesn't mean they always will. They can. They have that option. But where that option fails and people don't do that, then there's the fallback position, the sword of the state. Romans chapter 13, the sword, a better word, the sword of the powers that be. What if that doesn't work? We're seeing that happen now. It doesn't always work well. Men are imperfect, but I am seeing things happen that are good too. Governments in the states are enforcing things that are good. Not always. No, they're bad eggs. There are, as cops call them, dirty cops. They're dirty. They're doing the dirty things. They're planting evidence. They're beating people up. They're abusing people physically. Happens a lot. And where that happens and gets out of hand, and again, I'll refer you to the book, A Common Lawyer Comments on the Declaration of 76 and Constitution of the United States. Go to commonlawyer.com and you can obtain that book and see there, I think it's the second paragraph of our Declaration of 76, and I outline and unpack the test. It's a 6-part test, if I remember right, of how you know when it's time to throw the government off. It gets so bad, you need to do something. And if you don't do something about it, you're sinning. You're breaking God's law. God does not approve of injustice. And we have responsibilities as the minority, as the remnant, as the Bible calls God's people. We have powerful responsibility to do what we can to remedy what is false. That's why we're doing this. And you're doing it with me. We're doing it together. You joined with me in this. I appreciate it. Let's go through some more of it. Question number 8. How is this done? How's what done? Well, how are people governed? Here's how it's done. Laws are made which all must obey. Laws are made which all must obey. That word all there goes along with the word general welfare. When the government of the United States, the general government, as we called it in Washington, D.C., when it passes a law through both houses of Congress, and then the President of the United States signs it, or it becomes a pocket veto bill, it becomes law, or an expression of law is a better way to say it. When that happens, our Constitution requires that that kind of a law from that government in Washington, D.C. has to apply to everybody the same. I'll use an example that a Supreme Court justice used one time. I think his name was Sutherland. His mother and father immigrated from England to become Mormons in the early days, and they moved clean out to Utah, which was on the edge of the world at that time. They had this boy. His name was Sutherland. The family was Sutherland. I think his father was from Scotland and his mother was from England, but they were from Britain. They moved here. Well, by that time, they'd been Mormons, and then Brigham Young, or whatever his name is, or one of those Mormons, they ended up founding that school out there. And they still got a law school out there. Oh, Brigham Young University. And they got a law school there still. And their religion, the Mormons' religion, is and says that the Constitution of the United States is inspired from God. And they put it on equal dignity with the Bible. Now, that's false doctrine. The Bible, that's demeaning to the Bible to do that, by the way. There's nothing on equal dignity with this. There's no book that any man ever wrote or any paper any man ever wrote to shine any light on this. No, this is the light that shines light on all of the things. The light, it says, shining in a murky place, James the Apostle. This is the light of the Word of God. Our Constitution of the United States is not on equal dignity with this book. Our Constitution of the United States, though, has a lot of dignity because it is the culmination of centuries of observations of men, of the relationships between men and between men and governments, of how that works, how that relationship works. And where man's observations are consonant with this book, it becomes part of the common law tradition. That is the doctrine of our common law. The doctrine of our common law is anything inconsonant with this book that we say is common law, that is inconsonant with this book, is not part of our common law tradition. That's a centuries-old doctrine. This is the final court of last resort. Well, these Mormons, though, said that, and he went to law school there in the early days. His name was Sutherland. I think it was his name. Was it? Well, it sounded like that. I think that was his name. And his parents finally saw what Mormonism was, and they abandoned the whole crazy idea. But he did go to school there, and he did gain, even though he was Christian after that, he gained a respect for the Constitution of the United States. As I said before, the Lord do work in mysterious ways, and he will make straight licks with crooked sticks. In this case, he made a straight lick with a Mormon who had a false doctrine. He did, and I say to people like that, and people that are raised Roman Catholic, don't squander some of the fundamental things that were drilled into your brain if you went to parochial school. The Godhead consists of three persons. Us here in the West understand that, and we understand there's a hierarchy in that Godhead of authority. That's important, and if there's anything good, hold on to it that you see as biblical. There are things that are biblical that we don't want to lose. Take that part of it and move on away from the trash that you find there as you learn more about the Bible and worship God in more fullness. Well, that's the way the Mormons are. He got away from it. He did gain something good that our common law tradition, the laws of nature, as our Declaration of 76 says, is a good thing. That was Sutherland. And he uses the example. He says, and we're talking about general welfare, and the word all is a reference to general welfare because general welfare applies to all equally. All laws apply equally. Equal protection of the laws of all men, not just sex perverts or black men or white men or red men or yellow men. No, everybody the same. Affirmative action, no, that's not general welfare. Well, Sutherland said, what if I said, he was lecturing at a school one time, he said, what if I said that you had to be 6'3" to own a grocery store, and we pass a law in America that says that. You got to be 6'3" to own a grocery store. Now, when he gave these analogies, he would make fun of himself. If I remember right, he wasn't that tall, and so he jokes about height that way. Well, does that generally apply to everybody? Is it generally a law that applies equally everywhere? Well, it applies equally everywhere, but It cuts a fella out from run a grocery store if he wants to. What if somebody said, listen, everybody that has red hair, pass a law that says everybody that has red hair is precluded from having any children. Is that general welfare? No, that just applies to people with red hair. Doesn't apply to everybody equally. If you haven't got red hair, or if you got red hair, we're trying to oppress your duties to have children if you want to. I'm trying to think of a way, hypotheticals, maybe to apply that. Well, that was one of them that Justice Sutherland used. Cannot all people of a country govern themselves? Answer. If every man was perfectly virtuous and knew what would be best for himself and others, they might. But this is far from being the case, and therefore the people of every country are and must be governed. There has to be that fallback. If men won't respond to the Bible, the only thing that's left for them is bullets. I mean, if they get clear out of hand, somebody's going to get killed. Lawlessness brings death. And in varying degrees of the heinousness of the lawlessness, it will result in death. And Romans chapter 13 is about that ultimate jurisdiction of the powers that be to execute those that murder with malice and a forethought to kill another person. And God, in his wisdom, has given that responsibility to the governments that we form. If the process of our common law called due process is followed. Trial by jury. That's a big one. You don't murder people or you don't execute a murderer without a jury trial. That's part of our common law tradition. It doesn't exist other places in the world. It's in the 7th Amendment to our Constitution. Trial by jury, and what the power and the authority the jury has not to be questioned. And they don't have to give any reasons for their verdict. That's the point of Amendment 7. They are arbiters. They don't have to give reasons. Down here on land, in our common law tradition, that's being a God with a little g. Down here on land, a little g. And that's what the Bible says. And Jesus Christ references that this is the day of man compared to the day of Yahovah. Question number 8. A country must be governed. Number 7. Question 8. How is this done? Answer. Laws are made which all must obey. Whoever disobeys them is punished. That's simple enough. Laws are made which all must obey. All. General welfare. The government in Washington, D.C. has no authority to pass any laws that doesn't apply to everybody the same. Question number 9. Who makes these laws? All this is according to our Constitution of the United States and pertains to the general government in Washington, D.C., not necessarily your state governments. Remember, the Constitution of the United States is not to govern us, the militiamen of the several states, we the people. No. We put it there to govern the people in government. That's its fundamental purpose. Who makes these laws that all must obey? Answer. Laws are made which all must obey. Who makes these laws? They are made in different ways under different governments. In some countries, a single man makes the laws according to his own pleasure. In some countries, a single man makes the laws according to his own pleasure. That's called the law of the city. That's called the canon laws of Rome. That's called dictatorship. That's called emperorship. That's called imperialism. What does imperial mean? Latin word. It means I am the commander. What I say is law. I am the law. One of the most visible pictures of that, of course, is the Pope of Rome. And all the dictatorships of South America And whatever you're comfortable in your religion for government, that will be the government of your country if there's a critical mass of people there that follow that. That's why all the countries of South America are dictatorships. They're all Roman Catholic. In their heart of hearts and their deepest convictions, they're comfortable with an emperor, an imperium. What is imperial government? That's the opposite of common law government. Imperial government is canon civil law government. The Code of Justinian of the Roman Emperor Justinian governs almost every country in the world, some form of that code. What is it? It is government, listen to me, imperial government, the civil canon laws of Rome, the Code of Justinian, every country in the world except a few common law countries have this government. It is government by a single will. Now, that single will could be the expression of one man, one woman, or it could be the expression of a bevy of men. A legislature. And what legislatures do is they pass legislation called statutes, and they say this is all of our wills combined into one, a single will. Legislation, thereby, is dangerous. But in our common law tradition, remember, the legislator, the legislative branch, is not final. If the executive branch, the president or the governor of your state, and with that government, doesn't want to enforce what the Supreme Court of the United States says, or in your state what the Supreme Court of your state says, there's nothing in our law, of common law, that says they have to do that. And indeed, they never do all of them. No president, no governor ever enforces all the laws that their legislature passes. They pick and choose, and that's their prerogative in a common law government. And by the same token, Congress has no duty to follow the will of the president, the executive branch, or the judicial branch, the Supreme Court. And they don't, if you've noticed. Congress will pass a statute. That's an equal branch of government with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will strike it down and say that's not constitutional. The president will say, well, I don't care, I'm going to enforce it anyway, or I'm not going to. The three branches of government have a loyalty and sworn loyalty to the same set of laws called the Constitution of the United States, our common law. Who makes these laws? They are made in different ways under different governments. In some countries, a single man makes the laws according to his own pleasure. Very dangerous. What is such a government called, where a government by a single will? It's called despotism. Despotism. Or absolute monarchy. Same thing. And the person who thus rules is a despot or absolute monarch. In other states, a certain number of persons belonging to ancient or wealthy families makes the laws, but in any case, it's always a single will, even if it's a family. They combine all what they're thinking, all of their wills, into a single will called a decree. Call it what you want. It's government by a single will. It's called despotism. By the way, drop a footnote. New Testament, this is a Greek word, despot, and the New Testament says that Jesus Christ is the only lawful despotes. Despotes, translated different ways. I just like to say despot. Or you could, that's not a translation, that's just repeating the pronunciation of the Greek word. What does it mean? It means sovereign immunity. That's what it means. It's a Greek word. Now, there's only one. Don't let any man or any combination of men say, no, we are despotes. But people all over the world have been doing that for centuries. What is a despotes? A despot in Greek? A man who, or a combination of men that rule by a single will. Legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and the powers of those three branches of government all gathered into a single will. One will trumps it all. Now, republicanism, listen to me very closely. I say we are not a republic for this reason. Republicanism is where a legislative body is sovereign. Republicanism is where a legislative body is sovereign. Congress is sovereign, as the expression people say, of the will of the people. Well, that's not our government. That's not the governments of our states. Our legislatures in our states are not sovereign. They're not final. No, they are co-equal with the other two branches. To understand this simple point helps a lot in understanding what common law government is. Common law government is the division of power among three branches and many other sub-branches in those branches. We even in our legislative branch, our Congress, we divide that into two branches coming off of that one branch, the Senate and the House of Representatives. And most of our states do the same thing. They divide their legislature into two other branches. Nevada does not. I believe Nevada and, well, it's either Kansas or Nebraska.
It's Nebraska.
Nebraska. Thank you, Miss Francine. That's why she's here, to make sure I don't make a mistake. Nebraska has a single, what's called not a bicameral, that means a double box, two boxes of legislative in the legislative branch, but a single box, one legislature. Republicanism is that the legislative branch is sovereign. And when people came to America, they had that idea. They had degenerated into that. And during the English Civil War, they followed that idea. And I think some of the states, when we started, put that kind of sovereignty in their state governments, in the legislative branch, they said, we want a republic. They all found out real quick that that is even worse than a single man having that kind of power. We don't want one man to have power. We want the legislative branch of many men to have power. Same thing happened in England. They had the Civil War. Parliament, the legislative branch, went against the executive branch called the king. They had a war. 80,000 people died in battle in that war. Big war in those days, when there were only about, at the most, 5 million people in the country. 80,000. And when it was all over, Parliament won, and so Parliament said, Parliament is sovereign. And they called themselves Republicans. And they pushed that idea, and it came to the colonies. Well, it was a good step in the right direction, but it wasn't enough. They got all the sovereign power out of the crown, just gave it to somebody else. Remember that line? That line, Mel Gibson movie, Patriot. It was about a real-life fella down in South Carolina. It was built upon the life of 2 or 3 fellows down there, but it was true. It was adapted for movie, of course, but in the beginning of that movie, he's a legislator in South Carolina, and he gets called in to legislative duty, and the legislature meets, and they're discussing whether or not they want to vote to separate themselves from Britain. And he was a veteran of that ugly war called the French and Indian War, which the Americans spilt their blood to win. And the British Army was here as well, the British Navy, against the French, and we won it on the Plains of Abraham near in Quebec. The most decisive battle, people said, in the history of North America, no doubt, because that battle on the Plains of Abraham between the French and the English-speaking forces decided what tongue would be spoken in North America, what culture would be followed in North America, what religion would be followed in North America, Protestantism or Romanism, whether we would have the civil canon laws of Rome as our law, like they do in Louisiana and Quebec, or whether we would have our common law tradition. It's hard for us to imagine now how decisive that battle was. It's not even talked about anymore. I'm quoting Coffin when I say it's the most decisive battle on the North American continent and the most decisive battle possibly in the history of mankind, the way things shook out. We don't speak French. The French were here and they were trying to take over the continent, but they didn't. Fortunately, because freedom would have suffered accordingly. There's a lot more to it than that, but it's an important subject. So the Americans finally came back after they tried that republicanism bit. It didn't work. Rule by a sovereign legislature. And so they went back to our common law, which they knew what it was, 3 co-equal branches of government. Well, let's try one more. What is such a government styled? Such a government is styled an aristocracy or an oligarchy, a despotism, aristocracy. In other cases, people themselves meet to make the laws. This is called pure democracy. The people have a big assembly. That was Rome, that was Greece. They tried all that. They just said, everybody who's a citizen, come together, and that's the assembly, and we'll make the laws. What do we call it today? Well, it was revived during the French Revolution. We call it a referendum. Well, let's just have everybody vote on it. We'll decide it that way. No, that's not what God says. That's not what God says. And our common law government is not that way. We don't let everybody vote on it. Well, we let everybody vote, and we say, okay, who do we want for president of the United States? Everybody votes. But then who finally decides? An electoral college finally decides who's going to be president, who isn't. We have a lot of things in place here in our common law tradition to soften the madness of majority rule, whether in a legislature, a single branch of government, or outside of it. Democracy, republicanism operates on majority rule. Our common law tradition, in the final analysis, does not operate on the majority rule. What does it operate on? The unanimity, the agreement of 12 men on the jury in individual instances from whose decision there is no appeal, and they don't have any responsibility after they make that jury verdict to explain it to anybody. That's Godhood with a small g, as the Bible says. Jesus Christ, quoting the Psalms, said to the Pharisees, how do you explain this? He said, David, speaking by the Spirit of God, God himself, says of God's people, ye, that's God's militia, ye, ha'am in the Hebrew, ye are gods. Ye are lawgivers. Ye are final arbiters of right and wrong in individual instances from whose decision there is no appeal. Arbiter. That means you don't have to give any reasons. Why does he say that? Because that's what God has ordained in the 12-man jury. That's why. And that's why Jesus Christ impaneled 12 men to witness the evidence of his identity and deliver their verdict. One more question in this catechism on our Constitution of the United States. A state must be very small where all the people can meet in one assembly. Is that true? You better believe it. Can you imagine all Americans, all the militiamen in all America? It'd be over 150 million people meeting in one assembly. That's impossible. Answer: this form of government is only suited to a small city, as Athens in Greece, that's where it was invented, or rather a village, and can never take place in a state of any extent territorially. Our states are large, our country is even larger. One other form remains, that is, where the people, too numerous to meet, themselves choose certain of their own number to meet for them. This is called representative government, because those who meet represent all the rest. And this element, he says, and he's right about this, this element, this branch of our government is called republicanism. But understand, republicanism is not final. I don't care what the Congress says as our national legislature or what your state legislature passes into law. The application of that is subject to the jury and the courts. The jury is not a part of the court, but it is something that we use in the judiciary. The judges, the jurors are judges of fact first, law second. And it's what the legislature says is not sovereign. It's not final. What is final in our common law tradition? The Supreme Court of the United States, the courts? No. The President of the United States? No. The Congress or the legislature of your state? No. What's final? The 12-man jury impaneled from the militiamen of the state where they sit. The 12-man jury is final arbiter, final. Down here on land in this realm. Constitution of the United States guarantees a Republican form of government. This is Brent Allen Winters, commonlawyer.com, www.commonlawyer.com. And this is a Common Lawyer Comments concerning our Constitution of the United States. We're going through the Constitution's Catechism, Catechism on the Constitution by Arthur J. Stansbury. Questions and answers.